rule number one, don't heckle me as I know all of you.
You know where you live.
Literally. All right, so I have the honor of following Jeff. It's very exciting. I am today going to be talking about Xojo, how it's made. I stole the little logo from the TV show there, if you remember. And we're going to get a little nerdy and maybe take a little bit more into some of the details of what goes into creating the Xojo product that you all use and, of course, love. So let's see here. First, I want to recap a couple of Xojo goals to give you an idea of, how we keep focus on what we're working on. And primarily, I like to think of the fact that Xojo's goal in life is to simplify software development. That's it. Simply stated, simplify software development. And how do we do this? We do this in a couple ways. We have an integrated tool. That's, if you've ever used other systems to build things, you often find it requires lots of different pieces to get your job done. And in Xojo, we want you to be able to just use one tool and do all that. We have a single object-oriented programming language, so you don't have to learn a variety of languages to do things. It's all in one thing. And we support multiple app platforms, again, so you can use one thing to build whatever it is you need to do. Whether it's a desktop, mobile, web, whatever, you can just go to one place, one-stop shopping, so to speak. And we try to do many things, but we don't try to do everything. And that sometimes makes people sad because the one thing they want to do is the one thing we decided, well, we can't really do that. But it's important. Xojo can't possibly do everything, and we have to make choices and decisions. So these are the goals to keep in mind when you're using Xojo, when you're seeing the stuff that we're trying to work on. Now, you've all heard over the years, we say, Jeff said it in his keynote, Xojo is made with Xojo. Yes. 1,000% true. But it's made with other things too. So at the beginning, Xojo was made with C++. Ugh. Who's used C++ here? Sorry. Xojo, as Jeff also showed in his keynote, supported one platform, Mac. And, not the glorious Mac as it is today, the old Mac, the Mac Classic, the one that I didn't use because it was a toy. But it worked on that. And it supported two architectures. And, we all remember these because we're on that end of the age spectrum. But PowerPC and 68,000 are two Motorola chips that are no longer with us. But Xojo supported those. One target, just desktop apps. Well, in 1998, what else was there? There was a web, but it didn't run apps. And that was pretty much it. Today, oh my goodness, today, Xojo is made with a lot of things. It's made with Xojo, yes, absolutely. Still has parts in C++, which we'll talk about in a bit. Objective-C as well. TypeScript and Kotlin. So lots of technologies and languages are used to create Xojo today. Technologies. You've probably heard of all of these. Cocoa, of course, for Mac stuff. WinAPI, that's the new term for the old Win32 that Microsoft's going with because 32 is bad. You don't want to say that. GTK3 for Linux. We use lots of external things to add features to Xojo, such as SQLite and Chromium and LLVM and many more stuff. Platforms, all the platforms, Mac, Windows, Linux, Web, iOS, Android, they're all under the Xojo umbrella. It's a lot of things, way more than just old school Mac. And then architectures. Xojo builds for two sets of architectures in two different ways. You can build Intel architectures, 64-bit and 32-bit. And you can build ARM, 64-bit and 32-bit. Now, those don't all quite link up yet to all the platforms. For example, Jeff in the keynote talked about 64-bit ARM for Linux. It's not quite here yet, but eventually all of these are going to kind of match up to the ones that are supported. Mac and iOS, for example, no longer do 32-bit anything. But, it's a lot of different pieces going into what Xojo can do today. And of course, the targets, you know, all the desktop apps, web apps, console apps, iOS apps, Android, lots, so much stuff. So, but you all know most of that. So let's talk about what the 3 primary components of Xojo are. You get the first primary component, the IDE. That's what you're going to stare at every day, of course. The next one is the compiler. You don't really see that one visually, but obviously pretty important. And then you've got the frameworks. This, you know, you could probably make a case that this is the one that you are all using the most. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But let's dive into the IDE a little bit more. So the Xojo IDE, as I mentioned, it was originally written in C++. And there actually were separate versions for Mac and Windows, which was, you know, kind of crazy if you think about it. But there it was. And, you know, as everyone knows, having separate versions of software like that's not the best thing. But in the mid-2000s, it was rewritten so that it was essentially built using itself. Wonderful, wonderful idea. As Jeff says, this really helped because when your engineers are using the tool that everyone else is using, you know, we see things that are like, you know what? Nobody likes that. Let's take care of that. And so that's just super helpful and a great way to keep the product moving forward at a good pace. Around 2010 or so, work was started on redesigning the UI yet again into pretty much what you see as Xojo today. So the UI has evolved over time, like everything does. And today, the IDE itself remains mostly written in Xojo. And when we say Xojo is written in Xojo, the IDE certainly is the winner in that category with about 95% of it, my estimate, written in Xojo itself. And here's a little bit of fun IDE stats for you. So SLOC, who's familiar with the term SLOC? Everybody here know what a SLOC is? Source lines of code. So this is the horrible metric where you count how many lines of code are in something. But, you know, you got to have some way to measure something. So let's start here. Anyone have a guess on how many lines of code might be in the IDE? We'll start with any takers at 100,000. 252. 352,000. That is a Price is Right precise answer. All right, Jim, is anyone want to go? Now, what are the Price is Right rules? If you go over the number, you're done. So does anyone dare go above what Jim has thing? All right, we've got, Amy.
Shot in the dark, 500,000.
You're going to go with 500,000. Cam? 2 million for the IDE. All right. Well, the actual number, again, you know, these aren't down to the line of code. These are approximate. There's a lot that goes into building Xojo. But the actual number of lines of code for the IDE is about 365,000. Jim, come on down. I don't know that decompiling would help you guess that number too well. So the overall size regarding that is there's about 7.5 gigabytes of sources for this. Now, this isn't source code because that's text and that's not very space. This is more of what a checkout of the source would pull down is about that. That consists, most of the bulk of that is probably the images, libraries, and plugins, you know, the bigger chunks of things. But you know, if I would do a checkout on this laptop, for example, of the IDE from our source control system, it would pull down about 7.5 gigabytes. There are over 1,200 project items in the IDE. Anyone have a project that beats that? You do. How many you got? 30,000? 15,000. All right, that's a big number. In the back, someone? Robin has a fake project. So this is big. It's a lot of things. And based on numbers using my work setup at home, not this particular laptop, which would be a little bit slower, it takes me about 30 seconds to open the IDE project. And a point of reference, this is trending downwards very rapidly. When I first started on the engineering team several years ago, it was taking upwards of 2 minutes to open the IDE project, which drove me nuts. At the time, I didn't understand how the engineers put up with it. But we quickly started, because we use this stuff, saying, yeah, hey, we got to fix this. You know, our customers with big projects also have to deal with this. And it's been trending downwards, and we are continuing to look into ways to get that to trend downwards to as low as we can possibly get it, so that, you know, we want this to be like a constant thing. So it doesn't matter the size of your project. It just opens. So running the project in debug mode takes about a minute. So when I'm running the IDE in the IDE, it takes about a minute. That also has been trending down quite a bit over the last few years, and we're continuing to look into ways to get large projects to run much more rapidly. And when we do our dev builds locally, it takes about 2 minutes. I'll talk a bit more about what it takes to build the whole thing, but just a local dev build takes a couple minutes. I want to briefly touch on the debugger, which is part of the IDE, and basically consists of a few different IDE components. You've got the code editor, so when you're looking in the debugger and seeing the code that's on the screen there, that's technically the code editor that is showing you the stuff there, just in kind of a read-only mode. And then the other pieces are the stack viewer and the variable viewer. And as you know, those are kind of scrunched a little bit down on the bottom. And we are in the process of looking into ways that we can make the debugger present information to you, you know, in a way that's more useful, a little less scrolling around, get you the stuff you want in there. So keep that in mind. But the debugger also has a very important app component. And these two things communicate using sockets. So when your app is running, it is talking to Xojo via sockets, and commands are being sent back and forth. And the two systems are responding to each other. So for example, if your app hits a breakpoint, it's sending a socket message back to the IDE that says, I hit a breakpoint and it is at this address. And then the IDE looks up that address and then shows you that line of source where it's stopped. And if you've used other tools, you maybe have seen situations where when you hit run in Xojo, the source code at that point in time is kind of saved off, so that even when you're running, you can still be editing, modifying your source code. But when you hit a breakpoint, it shows you the source code from when you hit run. You don't get a mishmash of the newly edited code showing in the debugger and being very confusing. So we kind of keep that. And that's a little bit somewhat unique, but a little tricky on how the debugger is figuring out where stuff is. And of course, you know, as I said, the two are communicating back and forth. And one of the neat things about this design using sockets is this is what brings the remote debugging to the table so easily, because it's a socket. It's a socket even when you're on the same computer, and it's a socket when the debugger stub is sitting somewhere else. All right, so here you can see a picture of the IDE project open that reveals absolutely nothing. But you can get a few little teasers here. It's a little smaller, so you can squint, you know, do a zoom or something like that. But you can see that this is what I recently went during the bug bash when I had some stuff open. I now have the main navigator selected, so you can't see what I was really working on here. But you can see there's some tabs open for things like I think the code editor might be open in there, yeah. Some library stuff. So typically when you're working on the IDE project, we're obviously making extensive use of tabs. Having this few tabs open is, usually I have more tabs than this open. And you're jumping between things, and there's lots of code. But it looks like what you all guys do with Xojo, except probably just maybe more stuff, except for Paul over here. And debugging the IDE, this is kind of an inception kind of thing, because you're running Xojo. It's got the Xojo source code in it, and then you hit run, and it runs the Xojo code. Xojo itself is running the Xojo source code, and then a debug version of Xojo comes up, and then you're stepping through it, and You may, in that debug version, also want to open the source to Xojo again and run it a third time. There, on my computer, my Mac Mini that I use, it has 64 gigs of RAM because I can be running, 4 levels of Xojo on the thing. And, it's like Inception, where you're like, am I here or in a dream or whatnot? And, so I got to keep that top spinning all the time, so I know what's going on. But here you can see some code. This is a brief snippet of the code that is opening projects. And this part of the code is about to open a text project after it had verified that the project you selected wasn't any other type, and it's going to open it as a text project. So you can see, we're working with Xojo, using Xojo itself, all the tools that Xojo brings to the table. This is a cozy little room, so as Jeff took questions, I'm happy to take questions at each part as we're going through, maybe a few here or there. I'll take questions at the end as well. So if anyone has a particular IDE question before I jump into the compiler stuff, shoot. Otherwise, we'll move right into the compiler. Yes, go ahead.
Are you using the same version that we used of Xojo, basically the latest version release, or a newer version?
All right, so, and to remind future presenters, I'm going to repeat the question here. Are we using the same version of Xojo that the rest of you are all using? Mostly. Typically, I will build a debug version of Xojo using the current release and work with that so I can make sure I'm testing out the new features that are being in the upcoming release while I'm developing. But sometimes we also will just use the exact current release to do this stuff. So it varies, but yeah. All right, so the compiler. This was originally 2 separate single-pass compilers, one for Mac and one for Windows, 2 100% different code bases. A single-pass compiler is very fast, but it has a lot of limitations associated with it. And in the early 2000s, it was wisely decided that that needed to be updated to be a more robust multi-pass compiler. And then in the early 2010s, LLVM was brought into the picture. And yeah, we didn't really convert the entire compiler to use LLVM because the compiler has many, many parts. If you want to see or learn more about the parts, check out my blog series on the Xojo blog. 6-part, wonderful, wonderful, highly rated, Pulitzer Prize winning series about the Xojo compiler. But parts of it are now using LLVM, primarily for the 64-bit support at the time. And to talk about some of the multiple parts, the main thing you may have seen is this term Houdini. You may have seen this pop up when at the end of a build process, like in your task manager or activity monitor or something like that. That's kind of kicking off some LLVM components to do builds. And we still have the custom compiler that I talked about there earlier. And that is responsible for building Intel 32 stuff, which is at this point down to just Windows 32-bit apps and Linux 32-bit apps. And I can't wait for the day when we can get rid of that last vestiges of the old compiler, but we're not quite there yet. Those 2 platforms still need 32-bit stuff for the time being. And of course, there's a linker to the compiler. And the Xojo compiler primarily is building binary native apps. So when you build a desktop app, you get binary app. Everything's native for the platform that you're running on. And I'll briefly touch on just the slight difference here with Android that Travis will get into much more in his session, or so I'm assuming. So Android doesn't use the full compiler system. It uses a portion of it. And on top of that is a custom transpiler that runs after the portion runs. And it ends up spitting, and then it sends all that results off to the Gradle and Kotlin tool chains. And the end result there is you get what's called an ART native app on Android. That's an Android runtime app. That is the Android native app style that Google wants you using. So the Android stuff's using some of the current compiler system with some new parts glommed onto it to spit out your apps. So stats for the compiler. Well, the compiler is all written in C++, plus the LLVM stuff that we don't technically write, but we pull in. And we're looking at about 3 to 4 megabytes of source code for the compiler. That's just raw source. There's not a lot of images in the compiler. And slock guesses. Anyone on a dare a slock guess? Cam has a slock guess. Is it less than 1 million this time? 2 million? I'm not calling on you anymore. One line of code. So that's the Price is Right. Well, you would win if you were going by those rules. The compiler is about 87,000 lines of code. And like I said, if we were able to jettison the 32-bit stuff, this would probably drop quite a bit, actually. But that's what it is today. And that's about all I have on the compiler. Any compiler things before we talk about frameworks? Questions? No? All right. We will move on to frameworks. So there are multiple frameworks in Xojo. Surprised? There's the shared group of items. There are the desktop things, the web things, the iOS things, the Android things, and that was the last things. So actually, I'm not going to go back. But the frameworks are multiple. There's multiple frameworks, and depending on the type of your app you're building, what's needed are grabbed and pulled into your app. So let's jump right into framework stats. Given those many different frameworks, any guesses on Slock for that? Jim's there. Nope, I'm out. I'm not guessing that. 1 million. Okay, Christian in the back with 1 million. No, let's go with Bruno. One line again. Look at this. I've got these two professional. Well, Kem's playing to lose, it would seem, but.
I'll venture a guess. 178,200.
I love it. 178,200. It's a little low. But it probably would be the winning guess based on Price is Right rules, right? There's about 628,000 lines of code in all the frameworks. And they're in a variety of different things. The frameworks are built using a mixture of pretty much all the languages. So when I mentioned at the tippy top of all the various languages that we use to build Xojo, primarily those are related to the frameworks. So Xojo, of course, is used, I think pretty much all the frameworks are using Xojo in some manner or another. C++ is used along with Objective-C for the desktop frameworks. The iOS frameworks are primarily Objective-C. The Android frameworks are Kotlin. Web stuff is what's using TypeScript. And the web stuff also touches on C++. And probably some Objective-C as well. Maybe not. But as you can see, it's kind of lots of different things in there. And we, of course, do have to touch and use other tools. Oh, man. But it's not a happy day when I have to open up one of these tools to do something. But at times you do. And if you don't use these tools, consider yourself lucky. Some of them are a bear. But we do have to use those at times. And then, of course, the frameworks use a lot of third-party libraries so we can bring you features more quickly. And just to hit on a few of those, things like I mentioned at the beginning, SQLite, Chromium. We got OpenSSL, Unicode stuff, crypto stuff, graphics stuff, JSON, regex, and XML. So a lot of those are pulling in libraries of some kind. Some of these might be pulled in as a plugin rather than a direct library. It varies how we've implemented it, but those are things that get used. So to summarize these particular 3 pieces, we've got source lines of code for the IDE at about 365,000, the compiler at about 87,000, and the frameworks at about 628. You know, when I was digging through all the files to scan things and come up with numbers, I found it quite funny that ended up coming up to about 1 million, which was a rough guess that we all had internally, although we'd never really done. You know, generally there's not a good reason to know this number. It's not like it means too much, but that, you know, 1 million, that's a lot. That's a lot of code. So there you go. You know, Xojo is about 1 million lines of code built over 20-odd years. So a little bit more about making it. So how do we put it all together? Well, we've got a build process that really is, at this point, necessary for how this thing is. And we have the capability for automatic nightly builds. As Jeff mentioned in the keynote, we do anywhere from 2 to 5 a week. But we're set up that we could run them every night if we wanted to. During the bug bash, we were running them during the whole work week. But more typically, it is about 2-ish that we run unless we have a need to do it more often than that. Jeff also mentioned in his keynote, talking about the testing stuff. We run a boatload of unit tests during each of these builds. A good portion of them are built using Xojo Unit, but other tests are, as well are run. We also have continuous integration on the framework. So this means that anytime a change is committed to the Xojo framework stuff, the builder kicks off immediately and rebuilds all that. We don't do that for the IDE. That's done as part of the nightly builds, but the frameworks itself are built immediately. It is a pox on the engineer who checks something in and this breaks. So we don't, it's a, you know, if we were in an office, we'd all do the stare of shame or something. And this is all built using multiple services using an open source tool called GoCD that enables continuous delivery of things. And when this is running, it takes about 3 hours to say we want to build a pre-release for, like this week, I'm here. We're not likely to put out a pre-release to the forum. But if I did decide when I got back that I wanted to, and I wanted to hit the button because maybe it was I wanted a new nightly build or something like that, and I would say, tell the service to start building. About 3 hours after I told it to start, I would get the notification that says, your Mac, Windows, and Linux builds are now available. We would run through a few internal tests to make sure that nothing went awry, nothing got corrupted on the uploads or anything like that, and then that's what would get posted to the forum for pre-release testing. All right, let's jump back a little bit to the IDE. I want to talk a little bit about the run build process so you know what's going on there. And this involves both the IDE and the compiler. So when you hit the run button, and to some extent the build button, the IDE is going to render out a bunch of glue code. Now this is stuff that you don't see. This is code that does a lot of the Xojo magic for you behind the scenes. It's things like hooks up the menus so they're properly connected so you can just refer to them by name. It allows you to use windows as if they, just by their name rather than having to create window instances, for example. There's a lot of things that run there that create code for you to make sure that Xojo works the way you expect it to. After that glue code's rendered out, the first pass of the compiler is going to run. And this is what's going to do your basic syntax check, and then it spits out what's called the intermediate representation of your individual components of your project. That's all cached, so in theory, if something hasn't changed, it doesn't have to do the full IR compilation again. The syntax check is still going to occur. And this part here, the compiler pass 1, is single-threaded. So this is what you're seeing happening with the little dialogue that's on the IDE that's kind of spinning through. That's this part here, compiler pass 1. Compiler pass 2 occurs once all this other stuff has been finished. And this is what gets handed off to, in most cases, LLVM at this point, unless you're still doing some old 32-bit stuff. And LLVM handles the full compilation and the optimization processes. This part here is multi-threaded. This is where if you did look in Activity Monitor, you would see the little Houdini process that shows up in there. And this part can be very speedy because you can see, you know, this is the one where on my Mac Mini, for example, when it gets to this stage, the fans go, sounds like it's going to take off my desk for about 10 seconds maybe. And then boop, everything comes back down to normal. And then the last step is linking, and that's going to be pulling in all your libraries and plugins that are needed for whatever you happen to be building and packaging it all up so you actually get an app you can run. All right, so turns out that it doesn't just take tech to build Xojo. It takes a team. Jeff talked a bit about the team, but team's important, so I'm going to highlight that again. So current engineering team, which you will see in the next couple days, and we encourage you to bug us with questions about things. As I like to tell people, you can ask me anything. Whether I will give you an answer, it's totally different. William, me, Travis, Javier, Ricardo, we are the engineering team right now, but have invaluable assistance by the others at Xojo who may not necessarily open up the Xojo source ever, but they make it so that we can get stuff done. And that's Jeff over there, and Jason, who is not here, sadly. Dana and Alyssa are probably outside, and Robin sitting there making sure that what we actually do works most of the time. And I want to give many thanks, because Xojo didn't get here today by itself, and not even by this team by itself. As I like to say, we stand on the shoulders of giants here. Xojo has been worked on over the years by a lot of people. And I want to give credit where credit's due. These people have helped Xojo do things and implemented things. And Greg, Stefan, who's sadly no longer with us, and we all miss greatly. Joe, Norman, Tom, another Joe. Turns out a lot of the old engineers like to share names, it would seem. Aaron, Mars, Dave, John, another Dave, Mike, Andrew, Cordis, and the original Andrew, Andrew Barry, who created what ended up becoming Xojo as it is today. These folks all did stuff. I see comments on a regular basis in the source code for changes they've made. It's just, you know, it's not just the 5 of us, it's this whole group that got Xojo to where it is. Now, the team has a development process, as most teams do, and I came up with this clever, meaningless term called modified agile. But essentially, we have daily stand-ups. The group gets together, we discuss very briefly, like 10 minutes, just to say, hey, I'm working on this today, I'm working on this today. Make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes. Making sure if we've got a issue or some sort of thing that we're stuck on, that maybe someone else has some tip or say, hey, I remember that from a little while ago, you might want to check this. Just so that we're, you know, kind of pointing in the same direction and we got a rough idea of what everyone on the group's working on. As you're all aware, when we're doing pre-releases, those go out weekly by and large, except of course when I put this slide up, probably not this week. But weekly pre-releases. So we have a pretty strong schedule there where we put these things out regularly. As Jeff mentioned with the bug bash that we did back in August, and we've always done bug fixes before each release cycle starts, but we're going to try and expand that a little bit and do it more of a bug bash type focus. And these are bug fixes that happen before the pre-release gets pushed out. We have branches for major feature development. I'll show you a brief picture of that in a second, so that not everything's happening in the development branch. And as I mentioned before, the number one rule regarding all this is that Xojo itself always remains compilable. You know, I looked that up a few times. Apparently it is really a word, but it feels weird when I say it. So we can always do a build of Xojo at any point of a particular version. Multiple versions also as well. And the general goal with this development process is to iterate and improve Xojo over time. So we're always, you know, just keep making it better. So here's a brief overview of, you know, how some of the structure might look, or does look in many ways. So we've got our main thing is the trunk, which has all the Xojo source. That's usually what we're going to be checking out to work on for general development. And then we'll have major feature branches that are sitting off here. So for example, the release branch for what's in pre-release testing now, 2022 R3, is sitting in its own branch. And when we make, at this point, once it goes into its branch, it's primarily going to be just bug fixes that we're working on for that release. So when it's in pre-release testing, we've fixed the main bugs we want, the new features are in place, and it's in testing to fix bugs that people find as they're using it. Those bugs are fixed in trunk, they're pushed down to the release branch, and new builds are generated off of that. Last year, we kicked off a new thing that we can do going forward, which is actual full feature builds off of the other branches. So the Android pre-release that's been running for all this year is built off of the Android feature branch. So it's not sitting in the main branch. It's not ready for delivery. When it's ready, it gets pushed up into the main branch. And then the next time we do a branch for a release, it will be in it. I can't say when that is, sorry. And then the process repeats itself. So that's how we work. And new features that are big like that get their own feature branch so that they don't impact Xojo. And that's how we are able to put out regular releases throughout the year. Release 1, Release 2, Release 3, Release 4. Like clockwork, doom, doom, doom. And this stuff allows these things to just move around and do that. And that's the overall development process that we see. I've mentioned Release 3 a couple times, and it is in pre-release testing right now. And I just wanted to highlight, if you haven't checked it out in pre-release testing, please do so. There's a lot of cool stuff in there, especially with the bug bash that addressed a wide variety of things. As Jeff mentioned, it's 100% true. It actually had us going to parts of the code base that we've never even looked at before, or just have been ignored for a long time. And so that was really fascinating. But there's a lot of cool stuff in there. I mentioned already the project loading on the IDE is dramatically improved, and that big improvement is coming in R3, and it'll be for your projects as well. So you want to test your projects there, and ones that took an annoyingly long amount of time to open might be opening an order of magnitude faster. That's a great quality of life improvement, as I like to call it. But there's lots of other neat things in there, so absolutely, please, 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 go to the pre-release testing area, check that out, let us know what you find or how it's working for you. And then lastly, I just have to thank everyone here and everyone who watches these videos later so much for using Xojo. I personally have been using what Xojo is since 2001. And that's a long time, but I know there are probably people in here that have been using it even longer. And you know, a lot of you build stuff with Xojo, and that's really what, you know, Jeff said this too, and it's totally true. Working on Xojo is hard. It is one of the most challenging things I've ever done, and it is quite possibly the most rewarding because we get to see all the things that people build with it that might otherwise never have been built because other tools just are not approachable or usable for them. And it is just amazing to see that, and it is a joy to work on it. And that's it. Questions?
Nice. I love your videos.
Thank you. Autographs are out in the lobby later.
I remember we were coding on PC around 2009 and wanted to migrate to Apple and to OS X. And I remember the excitement at first hearing about Xojo. It was like hearing about this magic formula. And I was just wondering, you mentioned Andrew in the creation process, but I was just wondering if you could bullet point the creation, the concept creation, startup, scale up.
So bullet point the concept creations.
Concept. Who first thought of the idea of creating something like what was then Real Basic?
Oh, I see. So you're like, your question is about a little bit, what are the quick hits for how did Xojo come to be at the very beginning? And well, you know, that was Jeff having a light bulb moment when he saw the original tool, I forget the name of it. Cross Basic is what the tool was originally called. It was a shareware program from Andrew Barry, the person I mentioned in the beginning. And Jeff saw that and said, I think I got an idea.
It was just a hobby project for him.
Yeah, I think Jeff told me once that the dude had just a handful of people that had paid him at that point. And Jeff kind of at that point took the ball, and I mean, I don't know all the specifics. I wasn't quite there at the time. But he contacted Andrew and said, this needs to be a real thing. I'm going to help you make that happen. And it just went from there. And the key thing to understand, and Xojo has been around a really long time. I mean, since 1998 is what I put. I mean, technically it's a year or two before that, but I mean, that's 24 years. If you take 1998 and you subtract 24 years, you're at 1974? I mean, was there even a computer then that you could buy? So, and if you also look at 1998 and you say, all right, well, what things existed then that you can still use today? Photoshop, Windows,
Almost no development tools.
development tools. I mean, C. Yeah, but that's not a tool. That's a language. That's so it's just. I mean, we've been around a long time. We just keep iterating and adding things to Xojo and making it more useful for people, and it's great.
Startup funding.
20 years of Xojo on Paul's shirt there. That's what it's about. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
You had mentioned project items at the beginning of this. I think I know what that is, but is that like all of the controls, all of the methods, all of the properties of
Okay, so
of that, or is that something else?
So what does the project items mean when I said the IDE had over 1,200 project items? That literally means the things you're going to see in the navigator at the top level, essentially. So if you're using the text project, it would be the thing that's saved as a file on the disk. So it would be windows, classes, modules. It would not, each of those are going to have dozens upon dozens of methods in them, but I didn't count up the methods or anything like that. These are just the top level project items.
I'm old enough that lines of code used to have a lot of significance, but it seems like as you add to the GUI of things, the project items has more of a significance on kind of a measure of the complexity of the entity. Would you agree with that? Or if I can put it another way, I'll look at some Xojo programs and I will say, wow, this is amazing, and I start looking for the code for it, and there's so little code.
Right, all right. So yeah, it's more of a comment about Xojo and the code. And that's a good point. I mentioned the glue code when the compiler starts up. A lot of why when you add a window, for example, there's not really any source code that you're seeing with the window for it to even come up and be shown on the screen. That's all done by the framework and then any glue code that we have behind the scenes. You're just able to drag, you don't even drag a window, it's part of the default project, but you hit run and you immediately get something pop up on your screen. And some of the other tools will have that initial setup in place, but back in the day when Xojo came out, that wasn't a thing. You wanted to put a window on the screen, you were cracking your knuckles and working for a week to hitch all that stuff up. And you were writing a lot of code. So, but now that's all automatic. And yeah, Xojo's lines of code counts for most of your apps, I'm sure you probably look at that and go, this is a lot less code than I thought I would have had to write.
Right. And, last quick question. Is there a count of the project items anywhere in the IDE?
Is there a count of the project items anywhere in the IDE? No, the IDE itself does not present statistics or give you a number like that in any way. The best way, well, one way to do it would be to use the text project, which we always recommend, works great with source control, and because it's file-based, you can kind of do, essentially how I came up with a lot of these numbers is run some command line stuff to query things and get counts back and do stuff like that.
Great, thank you.
Yep.
And there are tools that will assist with that. Xojo Traveler has one tool, and I think Gary Pettit.
Yes, Kem points out that's true. Gary Pettit has a new tool he posted to the forum that does a scan of a text project and gives you back some stats on it. And I'm not familiar with Jeremy's tool.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
What is a text project?
What is a text project? Xojo has 3 project formats that you can save your projects in. The one that's been around since the dawn of time is the binary project, which is just a single blob that contains all your stuff. But it's binary, so you can't like open it in a text editor or look at it and make anything out of it, really. The other file format is XML, which is essentially an XML representation of the binary project. You can open that in a text project and look at it, but you don't want to. And then the third one is the text-based project, which saves each of your project items as a text file on disk.
Would that be similar to doing a print all to see the...
Well, a print all would be like a big, long, single thing, but it would be similar to that, yeah. You'd see all of your objects, all of the code in every method, every property would be in these text things. And because they're plain text, when you use it, it works with source control systems, which is so important for a developer. You should all be using source control systems. If you're not, see me after, and I will tell you why in more detail. But with the source control system and text, you can now track all your changes as they're pushed up to the repository, undo things if you made a mistake or want to take a different direction. It is just an enormous safety mechanism and just improvement in your workflow.
Well,
Kem.
not all licenses permitted. They used to be, they didn't all permit the text format. Is that still true?
What licenses permit the text format? All the ones that matter, all the licenses that matter include the text format. The only one that doesn't is the light license, which is really just for bare bones hobbyists to do anything with. Yeah, I mean, we really want people using that text format. Yes, Mark.
I have a question. You presented exactly, some information on how the compiler works and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know why I never thought of this before, but I'm a big fan of Xojo script, and basically it has its own compiler compiling Xojo scripts on the fly when you're running your program. Is it embedding a lot of that compiler stuff into the Xojo product to do that? How does that work?
So the question is, how is Xojo script fit into some of the compiler stuff I talked about? Yeah, essentially you kind of think of it as a mini LLVM that's sitting there. Is that a correct assessment, Travis?
Yeah, at a high level.
Yeah, at a high level. A mini LLVM is sitting in there to do the compilation. And, but that's just compiling the language, why it can be mini. The full frameworks, obviously, as you are well aware, are not available in Xojo script, but it does the language compile, and yeah, it's got a compiler sitting right in there.
In fact, Paul, Xojo script was was what we wrote first when we wrote the new compiler. Right. We wrote it as an interpreter, which never shipped, and then we made it compile binary code. So that's how we started the new compiler, was with Xojo script.
That's right, I remember that. Yeah, so it was pushed out a little subtle way there. Oh, your Xojo scripts are now compiled using LLVM before your apps are, and then the apps switched to it once we got it more ironed out. Yes?
How many nested iterations of Xojo are you able to run?
Oh, that's a great question. How many nested iterations of Xojo am I able to run? Well, I don't know how many I'm able to run. How many have I run is probably 4. Yeah, but that's weird. I might have just done that on a lark. 3 is probably really the most practical one, because you run in the dev build, which is running a dev build, and then in there you might want to run one more dev build to check something. Once you go beyond that, I mean, you're just showing off. Yeah, and each one of those is using, a couple gig probably of memory to run. So I do enjoy having 64 gigs to play with when I do have to do stuff like that. Not to mention that, that's just for the development part. I'll keep open the release one off to the side to test things. Someone reports a bug, I can check it in the release one, see if you're lying to me. And then I can then go through the dev one and check it out. And of course, I may have multiple ones, because that could just be the builds for say the 2022 R3 one that I have up and running. But I work on Android an awful lot, and I may have the whole setup again on Android running alongside it. So if you look at my dock, there's a lot of those little green X's. And I think that's probably about it. Give William time to set up. Thank you, everyone.